So in the past, we've done quite a few videos on The Last of Us Part 3 and why it's happening. And it seems like we just got some brand new news that confirms The Last of Us Part 3 is actually happening. There's a concept that's been developed and also some potential news on the plot and the setting of The Last of Us Part 3. So in this video, I'm going to go over all the latest news for The Last of Us Part 3, as well as some of the potential plot leaks and details. So if you're excited for The Last of Us Part 3, be sure to drop a like on this video, subscribe with your notifications turned on. And now let's talk about The Last of Us Part 3. So first, I'd like to cover this article from Entertainment Weekly, where the creator Neil Druckmann actually confirms that The Last of Us Part 3 has a concept and that there's probably a little bit more of a story to tell for The Last of Us and for the future of the series. So the article starts off with The Last of Us creator confirms there's a Part 3 concept and there's probably one more chapter to this story. It then goes on to say that it doesn't look like the story for The Last of Us is over yet. It goes on by saying that at long last, the news The Last of Us fans have been waiting for has arrived. Neil Druckmann, the co-creator and writer behind the beloved award-winning gaming franchise that has spawned the now Emmy award-winning HBO series, confirmed that he has now developed a concept for the third entry. Neil Druckmann dropped this news at the final moments of Grounded Part 2, the making of The Last of Us Part 2, and that's the documentary that delves deep in the creation of The Last of Us Part 2. And if you guys didn't know, that documentary is actually over on YouTube. It's been out for about a month now. Druckmann then goes on to say that I've been thinking about it. Is there a concept there? And for now years, I haven't been able to find that concept, but recently that's changed, Druckmann said in this documentary. I don't have a story, but I do have the concept. To me, that's as exciting as 1 and 2. It's its own thing, and yet has this thorough line through all 3. So it does feel like there's probably one more chapter to this story. The Last of Us Part 3 has long been theorized about, so it's definitely welcome news to fans for the franchise, especially after it was announced that the online multiplayer game had been canceled. But this confirmation now has larger implications for the HBO series The Last of Us. Season 1, which introduced Pedro Pascal as Joel and Bella Ramsey as Ellie, tackled the events of the 2013's Last of Us game. Season 2 is set to premiere in 2025 and will now begin to adapt the events of 2020's Last of Us Part 2, perhaps even more than one season. Neil Druckmann, who showruns the series with Craig Mazin, they remain adamant that the HBO drama will not veer from the source material. So now that there's more story for the games, that opens up the possibility for more seasons, which I kind of feel like I've covered that in a previous video, but if you guys didn't know, there's your information. This article then goes on to kind of break down these stories of the previous games, which a lot of this stuff we already know at this point, but I will cover the story just in case you guys haven't heard or don't know about the story of The Last of Us. The Last of Us game followed Joel, played as Troy Baker, a hardened survivor living in a militarized Boston quarantine zone years after the fungal plague ravaged the world and transformed the infected into zombie-like monsters. Joel was tasked by a rebel group known as the Fireflies with smuggling Ellie, that was voiced by Ashley Johnson, a young girl mysteriously immune to the virus. She was then smuggled out of the city to the allies on the outside. The seemingly simple task spirals into a cross-country odyssey for the unlikely duo. The DLC titled Left Behind was released in 2014 as a smaller expansion to the story, focusing on Ellie's relationship with her friend and first love, Riley, which I will say, if you guys don't want to sit through and play the games, which I really think you should, they're phenomenal. The Last of Us HBO series beautifully covers all of this information from all of the games, and hopefully season 2 builds upon the first one, but if you haven't seen the series, you definitely should watch it. Part 2 then picked up a few years after those events, which culminated in Joel killing many of the Fireflies in order to save Ellie's life, even though it meant the cure would never be developed. Living in Jackson, Wyoming, the community with Joel's brother Tommy, a violent event then disrupts her peace and sends Ellie on a vengeance mission to track down those who are responsible, and that's basically where we're left off for The Last of Us Part 2. Neil Druckmann does confirm that there is a story that the makers of the gaming studio at Naughty Dog have written that does take place after the events of The Last of Us Part 2 that are starring Tommy. He does confirm that unlike the headlines that came out in the press, this is not The Last of Us Part 3 concept. He states, it's always a small story, it was never the full title. He explained in this documentary, noting that the conflicting priorities at the time contributed to shelving of that project. I still believe one day it'll see the light of day, he added. I don't know if it'll be a game or a show, that's to be determined. He then goes on to say that the first game had such a clean concept of unconditional love a parent feels with their child. He continued, the second one, once it landed on the idea of pursuit of justice at any cost for the ones you love, it felt like, oh, there's a clean concept here and there's a through line through it, and the first game about love, it just made sense. If we don't ever get to do it again, this is a fine ending point, the last bite of an apple. The story's done. The great thing about working working at Naughty Dog is that we don't have to. It's always like, we would love another Last of Us, but if the developers feel like you're passionate about something else, we will support this other thing. It is a very privileged position to be in. Definitely some awesome behind the scenes and talking about The Last of Us Part 2 in this documentary, and also just kind of covering the thought process of The Last of Us Part 3 and just everything that went into producing these previous titles. For sure, some awesome insight. So now that we've kind of talked about the concept being confirmed by Neil Druckmann, now let's talk about what The Last of Us Part 3 could actually be about. So this article comes from denofgeeks.com, where they're basically breaking down the potential plot leaks and setting for The Last of Us Part 3. So it starts off by saying a third installment of The Last of Us video game series hasn't officially been announced yet, but here's what we hope to see if Abby and Ellie's story continues. So it starts off by saying, while The Last of Us Part 3 hasn't officially been announced yet, the odds of getting a third game in the popular Naughty Dog series has slightly increased. In the documentary Grounded Part 2, The Making of The Last of Us Part 2, Neil Druckmann, vice president and developer at Naughty Dog and the creative director and co-writer of The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2, talked briefly about the prospect of a third game, which we covered in the first half of the video, where he's basically breaking down that he actually has a concept built. This article then goes on to break down that there are many, including Druckmann himself, who are satisfied with the finale of The Last of Us Part 2's ending, and they'd be okay with the series ending there. But this is where I think the concept of The Last of Us Part 3 could actually be headed, and just kind of like the story and the plot. So it goes on by saying that finding forgiveness in an unforgiving world feels like the likely concept for The Last of Us Part 3, and to expand upon, especially since Abby's arc in Part 2 also sees her learning to trust and forgive people she was taught to hate and fear. Lev and Abby are forced to rely on each other after seeing those they love die in the endless cycles of violence they've grown up in. Abby and Ellie may not be able to forgive each other by the time their story is over, but they'll certainly have to learn how to forgive themselves for the things they've done and the people they've killed in the name of love. Depending on how much time passes between the games, there are roughly 5 years between Part 1 and Part 2. Lev and Abby could have already been a part of new Fireflies or on the search for them. Ellie could be trying to make her way on her own, not feeling worthy of returning to Jackson, or she could have even gone back to make amends with Dina and those she left behind. And now this is a pretty interesting connecting point. Regardless of where Abby and Ellie's respective arcs may begin, should they return as protagonists for the third game, the Fireflies could be the connecting force between them. Ellie may seek them out to find a way to make amends for what has happened all those years ago, or Abby or someone else in the Fireflies could make headway with her father's research and find a way to study Ellie's immunity without killing her, and now Abby has to track her down and convince her to help. Like I said previously, it doesn't seem likely that Tommy would be a playable character in Part 3, as Neil Druckmann already stated that the spin-off story in mind for that character will not be The Last of Us Part 3. That will be a completely other game, if that even ever happens. The Last of Us Part 3 isn't required for the plot to feel finished. Gamers like myself would feel welcome for another installment, and that's even if it was the conclusion of the trilogy. But whatever path this next game takes, it will undoubtedly remain the intensely real and gripping on an emotional level, just as much as the previous two parts. But whatever direction and ending we have set for this next game, it looks like we'll just be in for one hell of a ride. But it seems like that's gonna wrap it up with today's video, guys. Let me know in the comment section below if you're excited for The Last of Us Part 3. Don't forget to drop a like on this video, subscribe with your notifications turned on so you don't miss out on any future uploads. This has been Zach with VGL. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll catch you in the next one.